Grant writing is one of the most powerful skills you can have. It is the ability to draw attention to the challenges we are facing as a community and detail a plan for a better future. When successful, a partnership forms to provide financial resources that make that vision a reality. Hi, my name is Ellison Shirk, and I'm a professor of grant writing and the founder of Spark the Fire Grantwriting Classes. This mini course is brought to you by Travel Oregon to highlight the subject of budget development for your grant application, and especially how to track your spending over the course of a grant-funded project. Budget development starts with knowing our goals and objectives for the project. The goal is the broad statement of what we want to accomplish. An example of a goal for our project might be to enhance the visitor experience at our travel attraction, or it might be to expand the attractions our organization offers for recreation and tourism. On the other hand, our objectives specify how we will achieve the goal. Our objectives may be to construct a series of multi-use trails, improve parking access, and install wayfinding and trail signage. By connecting our budget to our objectives, we show our grant maker how they are purchasing results. In other words, purchasing measurable improvements to what it is we're trying to make better. To fine-tune our objectives and develop a strong budget, we'll want to make our objectives SMARTY. That is, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-limited, inclusive, and equitable. For the objective to construct a series of multi-use trails, we can make it SMARTY by stating that we'll build at least 6 miles of multi-use trails usable for all ages and abilities within 6 months of receipt of funding. For the objective to improve parking access, we can make it SMARTY by adding that our organization will add 50 new parking spots, 10 of which will be designated for handicapped, van pool, and electric vehicles, and that the parking will be free of charge and completed within 8 months of receipt of funding. For the objective to install wayfinding and trail signage, we can make it SMARTY by adding we'll install at least 50 multilingual wayfinding and trail signs within 5 months of receipt of funding. In each of these examples, we added the details to the objective to make it more specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-limited, inclusive, and equitable. Now that we know what we plan to do and how we plan to do it, it's time to do some research to determine what each of these objectives will cost. Some direct costs may include supplies or materials and labor. For supplies and materials, let's consider how the signs will be constructed. Should they be metal or wood? How large should they be? How many do we need? and what will each one say? To install them, do we need concrete and signposts? For labor, do we need a graphic designer to design the signs? Who will install them? We'll also want to consider whether we have staff who can perform these tasks, whether we will need to hire a subcontractor, and whether we will use volunteers. Or will it be a combination? If we plan to use our staff, we'll need to determine how many hours the task will take, then calculate the cost based on that staff person's hourly rate. Let's create a work plan and timeline to make sure we think through the installation process and consider unexpected challenges that may arise. By doing some comparison shopping for hiring subcontractors and purchasing the materials, we know that we're getting a good deal. For example, if we hire a graphic designer, we can get project estimates from a few different designers. Maybe we can get referrals to someone with an excellent track record. If we use a sign company to manufacture the signs, let's check out a few different print companies. It's wise for us to research so that we know what the options are and we can choose what's best for our project and our visitors. As we document each of these expenses, let's create a detailed list. This list will prepare us for reporting once the project is underway. We'll have one column to document our research for each line item cost. Then, when we start purchasing the materials, we'll use a second column to enter the actual cost. Let's plan to keep track of every expense because we'll need to report what we estimated for the grant proposal and what we spent on the grant reports. We'll also need to calculate the difference, if any, between the estimate and the actual cost, so we must keep track of both. Let's plan to keep a copy of all the receipts and make sure we get invoices from any outside contractors. And let's make sure that our internal staff working on this project keep detailed notes on the number of hours spent on this project too. We'll have to talk to them about the best way to track this to ensure that they are on board and will remember to do it. Now that we know that the direct costs are going to include supplies, materials, and labor, let's discuss the indirect costs, also known as overhead. Imagine that we want to make soup. The ingredients we buy at the store for the soup, the carrots, celery, beans, and other ingredients, are direct costs, while the pots and pans we use to make it in are indirect costs. The ingredients are direct costs because they're specifically being used for the meal that we're making, while the pots and pans are indirect costs because we'll need them to make the soup, but we'll also need to use them to make other meals. Indirect costs are general business expenses that keep you operating. These expenses cannot be identified as going to one particular service. Instead, they benefit multiple services. Sometimes a grant maker will allow us to include a contingency fund. A contingency fund protects our project in case expenses increase between the time we apply for the grant and the time we begin the project. For example, what if the sale of lumber rises significantly? A contingency fund allows us to include a certain amount of funding to cover that unexpected increase. Earlier, we talked about indirect costs. Indirect costs are the pots and the pans we use to cook the soup. In the case of this project, indirect costs are the operating costs of our organization. These costs can't be specifically connected to this project, but if our organization did not exist, the project would not exist. Often the grant maker we are applying to will allow a certain percentage of indirect costs to be included in the project budget. For example, a standard rate of indirect costs is 10% of the total project. Therefore, if the total cost of our project with a contingency fund is $50,000, the indirect costs or overhead would be $5,000, bringing our project total to $55,000. So far, we have discussed the expenses for our project budget, but what about the income? In other words, where will the funding for this project come? Obviously, we're writing a grant, so we hope that the grant maker we're applying to will provide some funding for the project. But what if the grant maker doesn't fund the total project cost? Maybe the maximum grant award offered is $20,000. I've even seen times when grant makers state in their guidelines that they'll only fund a percentage of the project total, such as 20%. That leaves us some fundraising to do. Let's plan now for securing the rest of the funding needed. Will we write grants to other grant makers? Will we host a fundraising event? Will we allocate some of our organization's individual donations to this project? We want to ensure that our fundraising plan details exactly how we will raise the rest of the funding for the project. For example, we might detail that we plan to raise $20,000 from other grant awards and $5,000 from a fundraising event, and so on. The predicted income must equal the total amount of the projected expenses. This is a balanced project budget. I want to mention one last thing, and this is a pro tip from the field. Let's write in the grant request what our organization would do with more or less funding than the official amount we request. For example, our project total is $55,000, but if we received $60,000, we could create one more challenging loop trail for experienced hikers. If we received less than we requested, we would reduce the miles of trails the project developed, but the project would still move forward. Letting the grant maker know if our project is scalable gives them an incentive to give more if they can, or if they can't fund the total amount we requested, let them know that a lower amount of funding would still move the project forward. This strategy increases our chance of getting a grant award significantly, and I have often experienced getting a larger grant than expected just because I included information on how that additional amount would be used for the project. So remember, let's get exact figures for our project expenses by researching every project cost before we apply for the grant. Let's include all the direct costs associated with the project, the materials, supplies, and labor. Let's plan to save receipts for all the purchases, save invoices for each subcontractor hired, and save timesheets for each internal staff person working on the project. If the grant maker allows it, let's plan to include a contingency fund and the indirect costs or overhead as a percentage of the project total. We can detail a plan for raising the full amount of the project, creating a balanced project budget. And most importantly, we can keep detailed and accurate records of what we estimated for each line item, the actual amount once the project is underway, and the difference between the estimate and the actual. We'll need to report these figures in our grant report and save our receipts. You are capable of success with your grant budgets and tracking. And if you would like to learn more about grant writing, check out the resources offered through Travel Oregon and Spark the Fire Grantwriting Classes. Thank you for your work, making our community a better place to live.